Hello, I wanted to go over the paper with you all using this video, and I expect that there will still be lots of questions that you'll have afterwards, but I'll do the best that I can for kind of setting the stage and interpreting the paper from my perspective. I think I'm going to try to do this in a series of a few different videos so you don't have to slog through all of it at once. This first one is going to be just about the background and the questions and the hypothesis of the paper. So let's go ahead and start. So the background to think about for the purpose of this paper is the people that did this research, they have two broad interests. First of all, they're thinking about um, studying theoretically or the concept of competition. So they're interested in this ecological interaction. And so they're interested in studying that in a specific system. But they're also hoping that they can make some kind of contribution to the study of fisheries science. And if you think about it, most of the fish or shrimp or oysters or whatever seafood or lake food or stream food that we eat, um, a lot of it, most of it, is not wild caught. Instead, most of it is managed, um, grown in aquaculture and farmed essentially. So people, there's lots and lots of people who are trying to study how to best grow species. Even if they are wild caught, they might be stocked, a term that they mentioned in the beginning of the paper. And when you stock a fishery, um, which is the kinds of things that you would catch. When you stock a fishery, sometimes you might be impacting the other species that are there, or maybe even the target species, the one that you want to grow a lot of. So they're coming from these two perspectives: the sort of fundamental um, academic understanding of the roles of inter versus intra-specific competition. Sorry, I reversed those there. But also there's a practical aspect to the paper, which is there a way that they can contribute to growing fish in a more productive way? So I want to think about the paper in terms of what is their general purpose and what are their questions that they're dealing with, and then also what is the hypothesis of the paper. So first, I think the purpose that they state early on in the paper is that they want to address, um, this is in I think the first page on the second page, uh, second paragraph maybe. They're fundamentally interested in what happens when a species invades. So we've talked about populations. There's native versus non-native or invasive populations. Sometimes you get the introduction of a new species and we say that that invades a new site. And they say they're interested in what happens when a species successfully invades an established community. And then they also want to know, um, they want to ultimately study natural systems, but natural systems are hard to work with. So can they predict the outcome of a natural system by doing small experiments? So this is kind of the setting, the specific questions that they want to try to address, and the real reason why they're doing this paper. Now the hypotheses of this paper were pretty tough to sort out. So if you had a hard time with that makes good sense. But I think a lot of the hypotheses were featured in this second paragraph of the paper. Now they're dense. This paragraph is very, very dense. There's a lot of stuff going on in it, but I've highlighted some of the sections that I think are going to be the most important. So first of all, remember in class that we talked about what a niche was, and that's sort of a combination of all the different dimensions that represent what a species needs or uses um, in its interactions with other species. So think about this in terms of the realized niche of a species. And they say that in the literature there have been suggested a whole bunch of niche-based hypotheses for what would happen when a species invades. So it's totally okay, in fact it's encouraged, for papers and experimental studies like this to get their hypotheses from the literature, from areas where other people have studied this question. And so they have a couple different hypotheses that they get from this part of this paragraph. And here, this part is highlighted, this part is highlighted, and this part is highlighted. And I have a diagram in the next slide that I hope to explain all three of these. But they basically say here, in situations where resources are fully exploited, so that you actually have competition, niche theory predicts that competitive interactions between invasive and native species will result in both of their niches being smaller than when they are in allopatry, in other words, when they are alone. Although another hypothesis, that's what it means here, conversely, another hypothesis suggests that increased interspecific competition might result in species increasing their niche breadths to maintain their energy requirements. I don't like this teleology here, so they're increasing their niche breadths to maintain their energy requirements. But this is sort of, think of this as a competing hypothesis number 2. So here we have hypothesis 1, hypothesis 2. But then they say there's going to be some cases where the non-native species is just flat out a superior competitor. What happens then? So these first two hypotheses were, think about the case where two competing species coexist. So that's relevant to the Zingy stuff that we've been doing. But here, in this other part, imagine that one species is the invasive species, or the non-native species, is a superior competitor. They're going to outcompete the native species. In other words, they can compete for the same resources as used by the native species and result in competitive exclusion. So species 2 wins, or the invasive species wins. So that's kind of the layout. The first pair of hypotheses is what happens when they coexist, how could they possibly coexist, and in this situation they're thinking that there's going to be a negative impact, maybe leading to competitive exclusion. So before I lay those out in a diagram, I wanted to remind you of a couple things that Dr. Duncan talked about in his competition video. You probably want to go back and review that if you haven't already. But let's just briefly talk about a couple concepts with competition. So here we have a case of, in the slide that he showed you, imagine that we've got this red species and it uses this portion of the resource. In other words, this is its niche. We've got the yellow species and this is its niche. If those two, if it's just the red and the yellow species, they're not competing, right? If we introduce this orange species, there's probably enough unused niche there that the orange species can make it. But assuming they're all sort of similar competitors, the green species is probably not going to be able to make it. It is so similar to the usage of the niche of these other species that its ability to invade is limited. And we call that concept limiting similarity. The similarity of its niche use to these already established species, say the orange one and the yellow one, is the niche use is so similar that it probably limits the ability of this green one to invade. That is, unless the green one is a superior competitor. So typically you can kind of represent the niche use in this way. Now, one way that could be sort of overcome, either ecologically or evolutionarily, is for the niches to compress. So what that means is the resource gradient that the red species used is narrower. Here the gradient is large, the niche is large. Here the niche has shrunk. And that shrinks because it is competing with this orange species and with this orange species. And similarly, this orange species and this orange species, their niches are also relatively smaller than they were over here. That is one possible outcome, one way that invasion can be sort of successful. And that is if the different species compress their niche. If we go back up to this slide, that corresponds to this part where in the text they say both their niches being smaller than in allopatry. That is niche compression. Their niches get smaller. Another possible outcome is this was their second hypothesis. Niches could maybe expand, and I've done this pretty sloppily here. Um, this is where they had the teleology. Maybe their niches expand, and yeah, there's a lot of overlap, but because there's a lot of overlap, they can still sort of get by, although they're maybe doing worse than they would if they were by themselves. And this is kind of a funny one because you would expect that their expanded niches means that maybe they're actually increasing the strength of competition. But I think what they're trying to say here with this hypothesis is that they're actually sort of diffusing the impacts on each other. So we've got two hypotheses here for cases where invasion is successful. One could be their niches compress, and one could be where their niches actually expand, which is kind of counterintuitive, yet they still sort of eke out a living and they get by even though there's a lot of overlap. That one corresponds to this part of the text, species increasing their niche breadths to maintain their energy requirements. The third possibility is, now let's focus on just two species at a time. The third possibility is there's something called niche shift. And when Dr. Duncan talked about this in the competition video, it was mentioned in the context of character displacement. There's a slight difference here. What's happening is the niches shift, they diverge, kind of one shifts this way, one shifts this way. And the character or the trait that allows them to use this range of the resource also switches. That's character displacement. So in the context of what he was talking about, this might mean that birds with smaller beaks shift this way, and birds that use this part of the range of the resource actually develop larger and larger beaks, evolutionarily, of course, not individuals. So the character displacement is the actual sort of measurable trait in the species. But you can think about this just in terms of the niches sort of move apart. They shift in one way or the other. If we go all the way back up here, that is this part of the paragraph. Competitive exclusion of that native species can cause niche shift or replacement in the native species. So that's niche shift. So here's the diagram that kind of puts all those things together. Their main question is, how do successful invasions happen? Well, do they coexist? If they coexist, that can happen one of two ways. There could be niche compression or there could be niche expansion. Do they not coexist? In other words, is there sort of a negative impact on this red species? Look, its utilization goes down, its growth rate goes down, it's suffering in competition from this yellow species. That could happen because of niche shift. Now I gotta say that I don't necessarily think that they did a good job of being clear here, and I don't understand exactly why this is mutually exclusive from that. I think they could both be happening. But I wouldn't call that a criticism of the paper, but I would say that if you had a hard time understanding these hypotheses, you got a good reason for it. So we're going to go down to then, we've talked about the purpose and we've talked about the hypothesis, or the hypotheses. Actually, they've got a couple. A lot of people had an easy time, I think, finding the three main predictions of the paper. And so I want to that's what's going to be the focus of the rest of the discussion of the paper here. So they had three predictions, and these are easy to find in the paper. First, that interspecific competition should alter the size of the niche and reduce growth of the other species. So this, I think, indicates that they were expecting support for the niche shift hypothesis. So they were expecting that this would happen here. There's going to be a negative impact on the native species, and their niches are going to diverge. They're going to be shifted. The second prediction was that impacts from intra and interspecific competition should be sort of similar in terms of both the size and the position of the niche on the native species. And then their final prediction was that the laboratory experimental population, the one that they do in the, not necessarily the lab, but out in the field, the experiment is going to mimic the outcome of the natural situation. And I'm going to talk about this distinction a little bit more later. What I'm going to do in the next video is I'm going to talk about the design of the study, the methodology, and then in the third video we'll talk about the results and discussion.